identity, and I was invited over originally to talk about aging. But my real subject is disability, and particularly disability related to aging. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And I'm not trying to advertise anything, I'll get to this in a second. If you want any copies of these books, if you get in touch with Peter, I can send over the PDFs, the original edited PDFs, because they're very expensive being academic books. And being academic books, they're designed to go into public libraries, unfortunately. So unfortunately, they make them hundreds of pounds for hardbacks and quite a lot of pounds for softbacks, or dollars in this case, because they're American publishers. But if you would like copies of these books, please let me know. So I'm also going to be talking about a related subject to a book I wrote or published in 2017, which was a study of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I was a fellow in 2011, called Blind Visitor Experiences at Art Museums. And that was a study of older blind people and adults going into the Metropolitan Museum when they had a visual impairment or were completely blind, and how they understood the paintings and the art collection within the Metropolitan Museum. And of course, if you know museums, you'll know you're not allowed to touch sculptures, which is rather strange because they used to be in public buildings many years ago. But of course, unfortunately, because we're not allowed to touch sculptures, you have to describe those as well. A very early study I did, which is 2008, I published this, is called Arts, Culture and Blindness. And that was about art education for people with who are blind and visually impaired. And last but not least, I promise I'll skip through this, a book on the history of philosophy. So for Peter over here, Philosophy as Disability and Exclusion, which charts the history of philosophy on visual impairment and blindness from 1680, all the way up to 2010, which was when I started writing that book. So without further ado, I will go to today's talk. So, as I said, what we're going to talk about today is cultural heritage, aging, disability, and identity. And it's a particular issue within disability that not many people talk about or even think about. And that is the understanding of the aging process on people with disabilities. And also the understanding that there are different types of identity of disability with people who become disabled or blind or visually impaired or hearing impaired in my case, or deaf, or people with learning disabilities later in life. And the people who have an impairment from a very young age will have a different form of identity. So my early research, the ones I pointed to in the earlier books that I've just shown you, looked at the comprehension, as I say here, of fine art and museums, and also technology. So how does a visually impaired person understand a computer screen in front of them? And I wanted to understand simply visual impairment and the effect of a visual impairment on someone's cognition. But as part of my research, when I was doing my PhD back in 1999 to 2005, when I was a school teacher, I noticed that there was a big difference between the people who were born with a visual impairment and the people who gained their visual impairment later in life. And this was really important because most research, and particularly in philosophy and psychology, so I'm pointing to Peter here, it's not Peter's fault, but particularly in philosophy and psychology, focuses on the idea that A, people who have a visual impairment have no need for visual cues or understanding vision or want to have any visual reference. So that was a very early understanding back in the 90s, but also that they would have no understanding or need for any form of visual learning as well. And so what we were teaching at the time was non-visual language, which I felt was a bit strange, because I was working also with adults, not just with school children, but with adults who wanted to know about visual issues. And even if they'd lost all of their sight, they still thought in a very visual way. And this affected the whole of their identity. Quite often, they didn't want to see themselves as a person with a disability. They would see themselves as impaired. Yes, I've got a visual impairment, I've got a hearing impairment. Like me, I wear a hearing aid. I think of myself as a person who wears a hearing aid, but I don't think of myself as a disabled person. So it changed the whole notion of their identity of disability. And this was really important because, as I've got here on the screen, the vast majority of people with disabilities are old. And what we focus on, as I said before, is the younger people, and quite rightly as well, because there are a group of people who are born with a disability and they need support to actually go into schools, and they need support for learning. And when they grow up, they need to have support in their working lives. However, we tend to ignore older people with a disability. In fact, we quite often don't call them disabled. We call them elderly people. And if you think about it, maybe your parents or your uncles and aunts or your grandparents, looking at you, a very young audience, your grandparents might have a disability, but don't actually think of themselves as having a disability. And people with sensory impairment, hearing impairment and visual impairment, over 90% of people registered as having a hearing impairment or a visual impairment are over the age of 60, 65. They're retired. And so this is a group of people we've kind of ignored for a long time. And they have very different identities, as I'm going to talk about today, according to when they became disabled. So, around how this works. So just a little aside here. This is a picture of Yosemite National Park in California. And I did some case studies in this book of access within national parks and museums in America. And one of them was Yosemite National Park. So this is one of my favorite pictures of Yosemite. So I started with this research question when I was writing this book and doing the study for this book. Does the way we experience cultural heritage differ as we age or acquire an impairment? Does the way we think change as we get older and acquire an impairment? How do different impairment cultures affect our identity? So, for example, if you go to a school for the blind, you're brought up in a particular culture. And when I was studying schools for the blind back in the 1980s, early 90s, I found very traditional schools for the blind, people actually had their own language. In England, they called themselves blinders. And they said they had a separate language for themselves. And people in schools for the deaf have their own sign language. And they have their own sign language slang. And so people have different understandings of their own identity based on their impairment. That's one thing we haven't really considered so much in disability, and maybe we need to consider more. So I also wanted to examine the experience of those age groups, the people who had become blind or visually impaired, hearing impaired or deaf, or had a learning disability or learning difficulty in later life, even people who had dementia in later life, and how they thought of themselves in relation to people who had had those impairments when they were younger. So I looked at a way of examining this, and don't worry, this is the theory bit, it's not the science bit. I'm not going to go into the deep, meaningful parts of this. So I'm going to try and keep it quite simple because this is more of a general lecture. But I looked at human capital and the way that people saw their value within society. And there's a lot of writing at the moment about social value and disability. The social model of disability talks about human value and disability a great deal. But we talk about it, or generally speaking, in terms of the original thinkers on human capital and human value. And as you can see here, I've drawn a timeline of studying human value. And this is a very rough timeline, so it's not mathematically correct, probably, in terms of the little line going across. But in 1776, an economist called Adam Smith wrote about the wealth of nations. And he was talking about money. And he was talking about human value in terms only of how much production people created. And as a result of that, he invented the science of economics. Then we come to Karl Marx in the middle of the 19th century, a bit over the middle of the 19th century, 1867. And he was talking about the human value of workers. Adam Smith was fixated with the human value of factories. Karl Marx was fixated with the human value of the workers, but he still saw them in terms of quantity. He still saw them in terms of money. He still saw them in terms of quantitative value. So in the 20th century, there was a change in this understanding. And we saw human value, not so much just in terms of money. I'm an important person because I have lots and lots of money. Of course, we still think that way, unfortunately. But I'm an important person because I have different forms of habits. And so we tend to see, according to Pierre Bourdieu, human capital in a different way, and in an intangible way. So, for example, if I am a teacher, a lecturer like me, I'm standing at the front here, I'm dressed like a lecturer, I have my nice smart shoes on, which I have my special shoes on for guest lectures, which I bring with me in a plastic bag. When I come, I bring my trainers at the back. And I talk like a lecturer. I try and slow down. I try and use my particular habits as a lecturer. So in a way, I'm supposedly supposed to have human value because of that. And so we see now human value as a different thing. It's not the money in my pocket because I haven't got any. It's the habits that I've acquired that give me status within society and make me feel included. And then Sarita Yardi, who's a brilliant technical capitalist, a woman writing on technical capital nowadays in America, also talks about the technological habits that we pick up. So there's an understanding of technological habits. But I wasn't happy with this way of seeing it because all of these people talked quantitatively. Now, the other thing is I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a quantitative scientist. I'm a qualitative scientist. So I wanted to look at this qualitatively. So I wanted to criticize these understandings, these traditional understandings of human value. And I looked for the ways that we look for ourselves individually, a sense of inclusion. And the trouble with the traditional writing on human value, on human capital, is that they looked at individual development. And they looked at a standard form of individual development that you had as a child, that you carried with you into adulthood, and then you had with you in old age. That wasn't what I was observing with the people I saw in my early studies. In my early studies, I saw that people had a different form of capital at different points in their life. When they were working, their capital was completely different. Their habits were completely different from when they were younger, as children. They would tell me, I didn't see them as children. And when they retired in old age, they had a completely different need for a separate sort of habit when they became older. So if you can imagine yourselves now, when you were a child, you did certain things, you played in certain ways, and those were your habits, your sense of human value and your sense of human culture. When you became older, and you're now at university or maybe even older, you've got a different set of values. And when you're retired, I don't know if there are any retired people in the audience, your whole understanding of life changes again. What do I need to do now? Especially if I have a disability. What value do I have to culture? And what value do I have to human life? And the traditional forms and understanding of capital didn't explain that, unfortunately. So it can be subjective as well. What I think of inclusion is not necessarily what other people think of inclusion, and the same for exclusion. So, for example, I don't feel very excluded, even though I have a hearing impairment. I don't feel totally excluded from life. I've got my career, I've written my books, I've got my degrees, I've done my stuff, so I don't need to worry too much about my hearing impairment. If I had a hearing impairment as a child, I'd have a completely different conceptualization of my hearing impairment. I'd have a completely different understanding about what a hearing impaired person was. So I'd need to reassess what inclusion was and how I felt excluded. So our understanding of inclusion and exclusion is different according to who we are and where we grow up, our background, when we get our impairment, and so on and so forth. So I tried to understand a different way of understanding human capital and human value. And I came up with my own little catchphrase, which is inclusive capital. And inclusive capital had 5 elements to it. And what I was observing all related to these 5 elements that are in this lovely circular diagram here in front of us. So the first one is bonding. The first thing we do as children, but something we do throughout our life, is always look for people that we can relate to. Is it people with disabilities? If we're born with disabilities, and quite often it is, we're born with disabilities. Or is it people that we just know from our early childhood, if it's our later disability? So if you gather a disability later, quite often you don't think of yourself as being a disabled person for the simple reason that you didn't know many disabled people when you were younger. You weren't brought up with a disability, so you don't know what a disability is. So you still relate to people without disabilities when you're older, your children, your family, and you don't think of yourself as disabled. So that bonding part is very important. Learning our habits is a really important part of our lives. So we learn them, generally speaking, according to Pierre Bourdieu, from our parents, first of all. But then we learn them from our friends and the social groups we interact with. And then they split off. So we have social culture and social capital, and culture and cultural capital, according to Pierre Bourdieu. So learning is very important within that. And to have learning, you need information. So information is a very important part of inclusive capital, gaining information to make you understand your environment and the connections that you have in your network of friends and family and the people you work with. And those are the people that give you human value. And in your case, university students, your human value as a university student, as an educated person. And lastly, the mobility. Now, mobility is a strange one because it goes into all of that. So mobility we usually think of as going from place to place, catching a bus, getting on your bicycle and riding around Leuven. But mobility relates to all of these things. So bonding is related to your ability to bond with people straight away. Are those people close to you? Can you get to those people? When you're a baby, all the people are within crawling distance of you. When you're older, they have to be within traveling distance of you, able to be part of your life because you can travel around with them. Mobility and learning is an interesting one because as you are learning in your university days, you're still being mobile. You're creating your own form or sense of social mobility. As you are with information, you're building a network and you're making sure that network is close to you. And of course, spaces and places becomes physical mobility as well, being able to get to a place and being able to get around a place as well. And what I mean by this is, imagine if you have a disability and you want to go to a museum. First of all, can you get to the museum? Can you get there with someone you want to bond with? Is the person you want to bond with in that particular area? And can you learn within that museum? So all of those things become part of your mobility. And so I've chosen 3 case studies today just to talk about in relation to this understanding of inclusive capital. And these 3 case studies are based on individual groups, someone who became disabled when they were older or gained an impairment, don't think of themselves as disabled when they're older, someone who gained their impairment in their later childhood, in their teenage years, and someone who does think of themselves as disabled, but doesn't allow that disability to identify their life or change their life in some way, and someone who was born with a disability. So this is the first person, the first case study in this. And this is a person I called Tallulah. None of these names are real. So Tallulah, I chose these names based on the people's preferences and the conversations I had with them. And so Tallulah was born in the 1930s, and there were very famous singers at the time called Tallulah. Well, I do love that name. I love the name Tallulah. Tallulah, when I was talking to her, was 84 years old, and she was from the West Country, close to where I grew up. She was widowed, and she'd been married for 25 years, and she had 3 children. She developed her first impairment when she was 52 years old, which is quite frightening for me standing here saying this, because I'm 54 now, and of course I have a hearing impairment, but she was a widow at that age, so quite young when she was a widow. And she said, when her husband died, it was almost as though it was the shock of it that caused her impairment, although she had to admit that the impairment had been there before, but she tried to ignore it. It became more pronounced when she lost her husband. She came to terms with her impairment, and it has to be said, some of her family were also impaired as well. They had, very similar to me, they had tinnitus, which is a ringing in the ear. I don't know if you know what tinnitus is. It's like a constant sound in your ears, like the orb. Am I showing my age now? The orb band from the 90s, an orb concert going on in your head all of the time. So she came to terms with her impairment, and she had technology, which is a hearing aid that allowed her to hear. Her mother, brothers, and sister had the same late impairment. So this was in her family, so she wasn't too hung up about it. But she didn't want to be known as a disabled person, as I said. Do you think, so I said to her, do you think of yourself as or your impairments as a form of disability? And she said, no, I do not. So I said to her, what do you think of these things as then? And being Tallulah, and I really like Tallulah, I adore her, just a nuisance, really. In fact, no, I don't think it's a problem at all. It's just something that's got to be put quite right, to be quite honest with you. And if you knew Tallulah, the way she said that kind of thing was very, very particular like that, as an older person would say. I loved it that way. It's great. So Tallulah, when she was bonding in early life, visited cultural heritage sites. She went to museums in Bristol, and she went around with her family. And so she gained a love of art. So I said to her, do you ever talk about art? And she said, yes, we talked about art when I was a child. We used to talk about paintings. This is a very old-fashioned way of putting it in English. Father was very interested in art. If you talk about father, from the 1930s, there's a very lovely traditional way of putting it. So father was very interested in art. So I asked her, what kind of art do you remember from that time? Well, mother had a beautiful painting of a convent in her sitting room. So she came from a Catholic background. In old age, similar to her heritage site, she bonded with her friends. But the schism came when she lost her husband. She was living by herself. All her sons had left home. And she had to find a new way of bonding because she was living by herself. So in her village, she joined art clubs and gardening clubs and went around to local cultural heritage environments. And so she said here, we go to old gardens in Cornwall, which if you don't know, is not so far, 2 counties away from Somerset, which is where Bath is. Well, all over actually, and we even have holidays. I enjoy going with the people I go with because it's very friendly and I suppose a way of making more friends for me. I've got lots of friends in Somerset, which is where she was from. So with Tallulah, she needed to bond with the same type of people that she grew up with. She didn't want to go around with disabled people, not that she had anything against disabled people, but she didn't want to see herself as disabled. And then her learning became part of this bonding and part of this self-evaluation of herself and some way of finding human value in her life. So she said here, learning seemed to have 3 uses. It allowed Tallulah to indulge herself in her passion for the arts. It allowed her to fulfill her ambitions of working with other children. And later, when her husband died and she became a widow, it provided essential human contact for her. It was really important that she had other people who she felt comfortable with throughout her life, throughout her older life. Her sons had left home and she was coming to terms with her hearing impairment. She didn't want to see herself as disabled. She wanted to see herself as something else. So Tallulah came to see learning as a way of life, as a way to get human value for herself, a way to feel her sense of inclusion. And in her late 50s, she studied with the Open University. She took a mixed art degree when she was in her 60s and graduated in 1996 when she was 63. So she was a very old graduate with a hearing impairment. And for her, this was massively important. So I said to her, what made you want to study art? I just wanted something to think about, said Tallulah. I enjoy going to galleries and I used to enjoy art, all sorts of art, not just modern art from the beginnings, really. And it was the time I'd given up my job and I was on my own because my youngest son had gone to university. And I just felt that I just needed something positive in my life. So aging has a massive effect on disability, and disability has a massive effect on aging. Information came into this for her as well, and she wanted to source information. She often felt information had increased value if it was obtained from the events that she went to. So if she went to a special concert or she went to a special exhibition, it had extra value for her. Tallulah also gained confidence from searching for sources of information as well. but not just on the internet, even though she did use the internet. She wanted to find that information for herself. So she went to libraries, she went to galleries, and if she could find that information in the gallery, she felt an extra sense of human value. So she felt value in gaining information from fine art from her visits. So I asked Tallulah what she found about this information, particularly about her membership of the Royal Society, which is in England, and the Royal Society of Arts is an organization that has a gallery in London and also a club, if you like, for people who were interested in the arts. And she joined this when she was taking her degree. I enjoy going to the Royal Academy, which is the exhibition hall for this club, where I'm a member. I enjoy the art and the changing exhibitions. I didn't always like the exhibitions. They weren't always to my liking, but I always chose the ones that I liked. And she felt a sense of loyalty to that academy because of it. She also was a member of something called the National Trust. Now, the National Trust in England is somewhere where they preserve old buildings, a bit like Leuven, for example, where you preserve your old buildings. And Tallulah just didn't want to join this organization. She wanted to be part of an old building and teach people about the old buildings and the artwork in the buildings. So she said she'd been a visitor to the National Trust houses and gardens beforehand as a younger woman, and she had respect for the institution. She also later volunteered for them though, and she grew in confidence because of this voluntary work. So she went to a house and told the visitors about the house. So Tallulah says, the house is more interesting to me than the art. It started out being the artworks were the most important thing, but I think now the house is more important to me. And I asked her, do you feel emotionally attached to this house? And Tallulah said, yes, I do, because I've been going here for so long. And I asked her, do you feel part of it? And Tallulah was very emphatic about this. She said, yes, very much so, yes. So Tallulah gained her sense of identity from her younger years. And when she had that schism, when she was older, that change in her life, that earthquake when her husband died, and she could have gone under quite easily, become depressed. She found that cultural heritage and learning about art helped her. This is a slightly different case study. This is Ruth. And Ruth became disabled or gained an impairment when she was a teenager. So very different social and cultural circumstance as well. So I'm going to grab some water here. Just take a quick swig of water. Thank you. Ruth's backstory is she's from New Jersey. She'd been born in New York, but she grew up in New Jersey. Very different place to the West Country of England. And she was 66 years old when I talked to her. So she was retired, but she'd been had an impairment and disabled all her adult life. And she thought of herself as a person with a disability. She moved to Maryland when she was a child, and she didn't enjoy that. She was born with a mild disability, but it only affected her a little. She didn't think of herself when she was much younger as a person with a disability. But her impairment became gradually more debilitating. And I can say here now she was visually impaired. That's her greatest impairment, her visual impairment. From the age of 13 to the age of 17, it worsened. So she became coming to realize that she was a disabled person. And she worked as a teacher and an educational advisor for people with disabilities. So even though she had a disability, she wanted to get her education. She took a master's degree eventually, and she wanted to feel as if she was a major part of life. She came from a middle-class family. She wanted to feel that way as well. So her early bonding experiences were with her family, and she wanted to feel close to them. So she didn't think of herself as having a disability. And as we find out here, she didn't have any family members who were disabled, so she couldn't relate to anyone when she gained a disability. Her experiences of bonding, therefore, were very settled when she was younger. She didn't want to think of her impairment as being a restriction to her life. And as I said here, she visited places in Manhattan, and that's where I met her. I interviewed her in Manhattan. And she wanted to be treated as normal when she was younger, even though she had this impairment, and knew about it. And as I said here, when I asked her if any of her other family members were disabled or had an impairment, she said, no, 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 I'm the only person in my family with an impairment. In terms of her bonding, there were two phases to her bonding. When she was younger, she wanted to feel herself as a normal person, and I say normal in inverted commas, as in non-disabled, but she wanted to also understand what she was going through as well. about her impairment, about her visual impairment. But the trouble was, when she gained her significant visual impairment later in life, she had to come to terms with that. And so she found, like Tallulah had earlier, much later in life, a real schism in her life, a real earthquake that happened in her life. She found it happened in her teenage years, and she had to get used to a disabled identity. So she did think of herself as having a disability. And the person who helped her with this was a counselor she came across at school. And it can be anyone that she bonded with. But in her case, in Ruth's case, it was a counselor that she came across at school. And so I talked to her about this, and she told me, but the counselor was a great role model. And remember, when I was graduated from college, and I called him to say I had graduated from college, he said, "How are you?" And he said, "Oh, I'm having a terrible day," and blah, blah, blah. And I said, "Oh my God, you've never talked to me like that before," because she thought of him as a school teacher. And he said, "Now you're a professional. Before you were a consumer." So she had reached the status, the human value of being a teacher, and she was proud of that. So she thought of herself as, okay, disabled, but at the same time also having the same status and human value as anyone else. So it's very important for people to understand and develop their own sense of inclusion within this. So her learning was very similar. She went to a public school. And when we talk about public schools here, we're talking about state schools in America. And her learning capital was split into two experiences: her early experiences of education and her experiences after formal education, when she went to university. And she left school and reflecting on her early experiences. So I said to her, "And do you enjoy art at all?" And she said, "Oh yes, I've done art all my life. I knit some amazing things, and I've crocheted, and I've done weaving. I've done sculpting, you know. I've done a lot more hands-on kind of art. I mean, I do it for pleasure. I do it because I enjoy it. I find it interesting." So art to her became part of her identity. The same with information. She wanted to gain information from museums. Even though when she first became disabled, she became nervous because she didn't want to go to museums because it was a different experience from when she was a child. When she went to university, she found it really, really important to go to museums. And she had a great experience at Harvard's museum, the Fogg Gallery. So Ruth's early use of information largely related to her schooling, as I say here. After graduating, she found herself finding a new skill of finding information from museums. She became the producer and the developer of information. So this is what she said about her visit to the Louvre in Paris. In the Louvre in particular, it's just awesome. You learn about it, you hear about it. Sorry, my accent isn't very New Jersey. You imagine this with a New Jersey accent. And it's like it's amazing to be in this situation that has such prominence in the art world. So you know it's really good experience. And I had time to review this again and again and again. And she wanted to go to art galleries to gain that experience. And places and spaces were very important to her as well. After she'd been through her working life, she worked all over the world. She lived in Israel for a while. She came back to New Jersey, where she grew up. Even though lots of her family had died at the time, she wanted to be back in New Jersey. And she said this situation changed after college because of her early experiences. And in adulthood, she had to come to terms with this new experience. So I asked her about her first times at going to these museums. So I asked her, so when you first became disabled, did you go to museums? And she said, not really. I don't know whether I was completely disinterested, but you know, it was really difficult adjusting. It would have been overwhelming as a disappointment not to participate. And so when I had the experience at the Fogg Museum at Harvard University, as I said, in my 20s, it was just wonderful. And it was just like the whole world opened up to me. So museums have a massively important place, as do all cultural heritage environments, including this library, for example, because they're a place that people come to find their identity, not just to read books or to see paintings, but to be part of their human value. This is a very last case study, I promise. Pierre was born with a visual impairment, and he was born almost completely blind. So when I spoke to him, and this was back in the 90s, Pierre was 67 years old and came from a family in North Wales. He spoke Welsh as a first language, although he spoke English at home, and he was married to an English person, and he was quite comfortable in speaking English. Because he was blind from a very young age, however, his culture was completely different. He went to a school for the blind, which was a boarding school in a separate area of England, in a massive city called Birmingham, and worked for the Ministry of Labour after that, straight away. So he didn't have an experience of being, as they say, normal, the normalized experience that non-disabled people would have. He later took a correspondence law degree when he was an adult and graduated at 42. But by this time, he'd been married for 10 years and had 3 children. And he was an incredible chap because he wrote as well in his spare time, and he did a lot of artwork, even though he was born blind and never had art classes as a child. In terms of his bonding, he always looked back to Wales. And he always thought of Wales, as he said, as a heavenly paradise, because it was the place that he remembered, he bonded with family, his mother and father. And when he had that taken away to boarding school in Birmingham, which he hated, he found that was the biggest disability of all. It wasn't his physical impairment, his visual impairment that disabled him. It was actually being moved to that school in Birmingham, a big city away from his countryside home in North Wales. His second phase of bonding was creating his own family as an adult in the Ministry of Labour where he worked. He felt he bonded little at School for the Blind. And he, as he said here, I had a brother who was very keen on music and literature. And I don't really remember a time when he wasn't both singing to me and also telling me the plots of Shakespeare's plays. My grandfather was very musical. He used to ride around teaching music all of the time. So learning to Pierre was very important, even though he learned in a separate environment. He got a sense of inclusion. He got that sense of human value by learning. So I said to him, or I asked him, were you taught art when you were younger? He said, oh no, I wasn't taught art at all as a child at school. I mean, the only thing I was doing some craft work and raffia. And I think that's the same experience for people who are disabled on the continent here as well. You tend to, in those days, schools for blind taught raffia work. Whereas I remember strongly the look of things back home on the farm, like the look of sunshine on flowers. My visual memories of school were very dim indeed. He had very little residual vision. So I asked him, did you think about sculpture at all? Because one of the traditional things for people who are born blind is to teach them about sculpture, something they could touch. He said, no, I didn't think about sculptural paintings at all when I was younger. As far as sculpture went, I got my first experience of sculpture going to an exhibition in Nottingham about 30 years ago, so about when he was 37, late 30s, and seeing a couple of pieces by Henry Moore. That was my first experience of sculpture. So he wasn't even taught about a form of art he could understand. So in terms of sourcing information, Pierre went out and tried to find his own information about paintings later. So he never thought about paintings when he was a child, but when he was introduced to them as an adult, when he was married to a sighted woman, he wanted to know all about them. So he said, here, the first experience I can remember of coming across a painting was when I just got married. And one of my bridesmaids had a record of flamenco music, and there was a picture by Goya on this thing, on the cover of the record. And he couldn't see the picture, but he wanted it described to him. And I wanted to know what it was like. I think until then, I used to go to my in-laws' garden, and they had a very large garden, and my fiance used to try and show me the shapes of leaves and stuff. I wasn't really terribly interested at the time, but somehow this Goya painting seemed to interest me because it had a story to it. So places and spaces to Pierre were very important too. In getting inclusive capital, he wanted to become part of his Welsh identity. And he saw his disabled identity as being different from his Welsh identity. It was his Welsh identity for him that gave him a sense of value. Okay, so how do I conclude these case studies? Well, the case studies of impaired people in early life found the transitions between moving to places difficult. For each of the interviewees, it was important to develop inclusive capital in the period where they had different transitions in their life. They find mainstream cultural activities are important, as well as relating to emotionally good emotional experiences, early experiences. So when you're older, you tend to want to hark back, and I can relate to this myself now, I'm in my mid-50s, to your earlier life. And case studies gain impairment in old age, or case studies that gain impairment in old age, find this transition difficult. People with visual impairment and hearing impairment, when they're past the age of retirement, very rarely want to see themselves as a person with a disability. They think of themselves as impaired, hearing impaired, sight impaired, but not as a person with a disability. because that devalues their sense of human value and their sense of inclusive capital. Cases who found themselves disabled in later childhood, however, found it difficult to transition into a disabled identity as adults, but when they did, they found it comfortable and they could move on quite easily. So they could get used to this new form of identity. However, people who became disabled in early life, oops, sorry, one slide too far, became disabled in early life, found it easier to go into old age with their disability and think of themselves as a person with a disability. So my conclusions in general were very simple. People have a different sense of identity according to the stage at which they became disabled, rather than their actual physical identity, their visual impairment, their hearing impairment, their learning disability. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. Well done for listening so intently. It's very warm in here, isn't it? Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Simon. You were so fast, so keen on starting your talk that I didn't even get the opportunity to introduce you. I'm sorry about that. I think I made a wrong move by coming down here. But anyway, I'm very glad we could hear you talk. So just a quick note for those who are here with us online. I mean, everyone here actually. So there's some people attending online, so somehow they're over there. I don't know. Anyway, so this is a sort of joint venture between the Leuven Disability Film Festival, organized by Peter Verstraeten, who is also part of the steering committee of the Leuven Center for Health Humanities. And so the Leuven Center is also, I mean, this is a joint venture between Leuven Disability Film Festival and the Leuven Center for Health Humanities. And so we're very happy to have Professor Hayhoe here to talk about his research. Now, just a quick note, if you want to ask a question, I mean, this applies to people here in the audience, just raise your hand and I'll give you the microphone. It's important that you use the microphone so people online can actually hear you and follow the conversation. If you're attending online and you want to ask a question, that's also possible. Just send me a message via chat and I'll make sure to give a hint if it's your turn to ask your question. So with that said, the floor is open for questions. Anyone has a question for our speaker? Maybe I can, okay, Ortwin, you go first.
Yes, thank you very much, Simon, for this very interesting field that I know next to nothing about, which is what makes it interesting for all of us, I think, to hear of your experience with this. Over the past sort of 20, 30 years, there have been dramatic improvements in technological possibilities to aid people with various kinds of impairments. Specifically, audio description has moved on amazingly. And I'm just wondering, could you share with us because you've been doing this for a couple of decades now, what to you are the main changes technologically, but also has there been a change in the curators of our heritage? Have they come to see the light or heard the sound and heard the right message of opening up the treasures that they hold for a wider sort of public?
Thank you so much. And that's a brilliant question. It's almost as if it was planted. Well done. Thank you so much. Yes, there's been a massive shift. So I started work in 1993, which I've just realized is 30 years this year. It's not quite 30 years because I started in October 1993. So that's 30 years I've been doing this. And back then, you had very, very few people doing audio description, or as they called it in America, verbal imaging. So verbal imaging of paintings is describing a painting or describing a film as it's going on. You have had virtually very hearing impairment could get the captions, but those were usually to do with language rather than to do with hearing impairment. So if you were hearing impaired, you had virtually no assistance whatsoever. And now you have these little things we keep in our pockets called mobile phones, cell phones, and also iPads. iPads revolutionized everything in 2012, but also people's attitudes changed massively. Because in the old days, we thought of a few Braille labels as being access. And in the UK or America, we had a few Braille labels on certain exhibits, on not much else. And I think you've had the same on the continent. I remember Amsterdam Museum having some Braille labels, and the Louvre in Paris having some touch art experiences with books and so forth. The British Museum did as well, and the Metropolitan Museum did in New York. But it was very little, and it was usually paper-based. The shift in people's attitudes has been phenomenal. It's been like an earthquake. Again, I keep on talking about earthquakes, but it has been a seismic shift, tidal wave. And it seems nowadays, especially with acts coming in, for example, in America, the American with Disabilities Act, in Britain, the Equalities Act, and prior to that, the Disability Discrimination Act. And I know there are similar laws. If you get public your building, you have to have some form of accessibility. And so there are courses now in universities, thankfully, and keep me in work, that actually train people in access to heritage environments and also the use of assistive technologies. And I think the assistive technology element of it has, when you walk into a museum, if you're hearing impaired or visually impaired, where you don't need to interact with the access department in that museum, you can just hear the verbal imaging of paintings as you go around from the app. So you don't actually need to identify yourself as a person with disability, as you did in those days. In 1993, there were only special courses or any special tours for people with disabilities. Now you can go in and you're included in whichever way you like. And culturally, as I was talking about here, that's a major thing for people with disabilities, because people with disabilities, if they've gained them in later life, don't want to be identified as having a disability. Sorry, there's someone behind me there. I could see people chortling at the people at the back. So I think the biggest shift has been that cultural shift, that understanding that we need to do something in all museums, but also not identify people as having disabilities. And technology, because it's moved on so massively, has allowed us to do that. But thank you so much. That's a really interesting question. Thanks.
Yes, more questions.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, just a personal thank you. I was diagnosed with autism at a quite young age, and I'm now kind of putting in the work to consider how I developed as a person with that autism, and having this comparison now of like the kind of bonding that you do, the learning that you do, as someone considered with what is then considered, I guess, a mental disability, a label that I always refused.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now I'm kind of accepting like, okay, this is affecting my life, whether I like it or not. Let's see how I can mobilize myself and move around it. So in that sense, a personal thank you. I'm here on behalf of a Center for Cultural Heritage, but Music and Performing Arts Heritage. And we have been for a very long while involved with what Laura Jane Smith would, I guess, describe as the authorized heritage discourse. So very much these very institutionalized, official, subsidized, formal, or even equated with national identity forms of theater or music, often classical music. And more, we're starting to see as an organization that in production and in consumption, there are very diverse ways that people engage with it. And I was curious if this is something that came up in your studies as well, because the case studies that you presented have been, I guess, mostly from a consuming side. And I'm very interested in, I'd say, from a more productive side, how this maybe came forward in case studies, or whether this theory could also work there, because I've been taking extensive notes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that. Yes, indeed. I don't want to do a completely different lecture, which I'd have to do if I was doing this, but I've looked at performances by people with disabilities. If you want to ask Peter for one of my books again, or you can download a free paper from the National Federation of the Blind about an artist in Turkey called Eşref Armagan. And Eşref has been blind from birth, and he's a painter. And if you look at arts, culture, and blindness, there were lessons and lectures on acting for people with visual impairment. So I had case studies of people attending acting lessons, especially in those days. This was 1993 when I was doing the observations, 1994, specifically for people with visual impairment, but they were learning to act to become actors. So yes, I certainly have a case studies I can provide. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'm looking around. Peter has a question. I'm eyeing the students as well. This is your opportunity to ask questions. Don't be
Students will
shy.
always look down at their shoes at this point. That's just like that.
That's understandable. Peter, you had a question.
Yes,
Peter.
thank you very much, Simon, for a wonderful lecture. I was really intrigued by the topic of inclusive capital. And so my question is related to the new ICOM definition of museum,
Right.
where inclusion also plays a very, very important role. And so on the basis of that new definition of what a museum is, I was wondering how you kind of look towards the organization of separated tours for persons with visual impairments, because that is obviously a nice way to make a museum accessible, but
Right.
at the same time, you definitely can ask questions about it. And so I was wondering how you react to these kind of initiatives. Do you consider them as being really inclusionary on the
Right.
basis of your own model, or do you think of them in another particular way? So, yeah.
Really important question, Peter. And this relates to this gentleman here. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, Simon. Thank you so much. And this is very important because it's how people identify themselves as developing their own inclusive capital. And for some people, and there tends to be a very political movement, either you're against or you're for these type of separate courses. If you don't know, there are separate courses for people with visual impairment or hearing impairment in museums or universities. They have some, and in art colleges and so forth. And there's a big debate about whether we should provide this or not. And this is very similar to a special school. Do we have any educationalists in the audience? Fantastic, educationalists. The same debate was had with special schools as well. Should we close special schools or should we keep them open? And I researched this for the book I showed you earlier, which is Philosophy, Disability and Exclusion. That became a political issue. And the simple fact is, some people want separate courses. And we are at the stage now in certain museums of, for example, providing quiet times for people with on the autistic spectrum before other people come into the museum. Because if people on the autistic spectrum go into the museum at certain times when there's a lot of activity in the museum, they can find it very stressful. And so lots of museums are providing quiet times at certain times in the morning where the museum's closed to the public to actually go in. So in terms of people with autistic spectrum, on the autistic spectrum, then we have a situation that we had with visual impairment and hearing impairment a few decades ago. I think there are some people still that want to have their own separate art courses, their own separate tours, and that's perfectly all right. And in particular, people who are brought up with a visual impairment or a hearing impairment, they feel comfortable in that environment. And there's no reason why they shouldn't be. But there are, again, as I showed here with the case studies, other people who don't want to be part of that group and they want to go in separately. So unfortunately, we have to diversify our inclusion. We can't just think of inclusion as we used to think of with human capital as one single thing, as being just one form of inclusion. We have to think of multiple forms of inclusion. And if you're an educationalist, then you'll know that you have to teach each child individually for that diversification in classroom. The same thing happens with diversification and inclusion. We need to think about the human being behind the inclusion. We can't just create one form of technology. We have to create several forms of technology that make people feel comfortable. And luckily enough, we can do that now with apps because we have universal design. We need to have an understanding of universal design for learning, for example, one example, but also multiple forms of inclusion. Don't just think of inclusion as one thing, but multiple things. So thank you for that, Peter. That's a really interesting question.
So we have some questions coming in the chat. So there's one question, I'll read them out loud.
Great.
Because I asked Arlene, so she's got Arlene Jackson. She had a question. I'll ask it for you, Arlene. I may ask with regard to new ways of bonding. Did you perceive a change in attitudes the COVID pandemic? News about representation that many of these practices have now regretted.
It changed the game entirely. And I think people underestimate how much it did change museum environments entirely and education as a whole. In some ways, it made inclusion a lot better. And in some ways, it made inclusion completely terrible. But we were all excluded. So hey, we were all on the same plane, and the gauge with museums changed because of it. A lot of museums, because they don't think museums are for them. So they don't want to actually end, and those people come along and look at the website museum or take online because it was online and they were in a pandemic, they were locked inside, they needed to do something. So I think in a way it has expanded access massively, but we've got to see the long-term issue with this because physical buildings will always be the main form of access. And I want to see how that works out in 10 years' time. So I can answer the question now, but who knows in 10 years' time? Thank you.
We'll ask you again in 10 years' time. There's somebody holding up his hand, Richard Bourdieu, on the left top. Richard, would you mind switching on your video and asking your question yourself? Let's see if that works. Hi.
Hi, Richard.
Hey, all right, thank you. My name is Richard Bourdieu, and I'm an MA student in bioethics and medical law at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, here in London.
Great.
And I'm from Ghana originally. My question, okay, last year I was in the US, sponsored by the Department of State for a program in disability access. So when I came across this webinar, it's really got my attention. So my question is in twofold. I want to find out, Simon, in terms of millennials, in confronting, are we ready to confront the topic of aging? You know, as bearing in mind that we will grow, we all will grow and become aged, and a lot of impairment, disabilities will come in. Are we actually ready as young people, as millennials? That's the first question. And the second question is, during our debates about disabilities and aging, do we appeal to philosophy or ethics, the ethics of disability in our discussions and interventions, approaches, and all of that? I just want to ask, just because I'm a bioethicist, I just wanted to find out whether there is some element of ethics in terms of whenever we are discussing these issues.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, I'm looking at the screen and I realized I got my back to the audience and the camera, so I apologize for that. Richard, you're probably talking to the back of my head there, and I apologize. St. Mary's, I know it very well. It's great to have you there. I used to live in Hampton Wick and I used to be a school teacher in Chiswick. So you'll know what that means. That's West London talk. So, I used to live not far from where Richard is now. That's great. Two brilliant questions. Do we have a sense of what it is to be old now, or are we getting a greater sense of that? The first answer is, I think we're at the beginnings of that understanding. A few years ago, we would have never had this talk about aging and disability. It just wouldn't have been a topic. We didn't understand what aging and disability meant. We thought of disability as being born with disability, and we only talked about that. Now, we understand that most people who have their disability are older. We don't understand it very much. It's a bit like, we're at the Charles Darwin stage where we've discovered the Galapagos Islands, and now we have to talk about evolution. So I don't think we've got very far in understanding who we are at the moment. So I think you're absolutely right, Richard. I think we are very ignorant as a community, as a culture, but in Europe, in Britain, everywhere, of our understanding of people who are aging and people with disabilities when they're aging. So I completely agree with that. Secondly, in terms of bioethics, unfortunately, ethics are only talked about in terms of medicine at the moment, in terms of bioethics, aren't they? Let's be honest. And if you study disability, you'll know that there's a medical model and the social model. And we only ever think of ethics in terms of that medical model. Is it right to do an operation on someone? Is it right to give them a technology or a treatment or a therapy, for example? We never think of the ethics of being old. Should we look after older people? Now it's strange. I don't know, Richard, you look a very much younger person than me. So I'm going to say, so, but when I was growing up in the 70s and the early 80s, we still had some respect for older people. And I think a lot of that, unfortunately, has drifted off. And we don't respect older people. I'm not saying we have to do everything older people tell us to do. My grandmother used to give me a clip around the ear if I didn't do what I told to do. And I think, you know, maybe we need to change our attitudes to that as well. But we don't have that respect for older people as we used to. And I think the understanding, for example, of extended family has also removed that understanding of aging now, because children don't live with people who are getting much older, unless they're my children who are 7 and 12 and live with an old man in their household. So I think because we've drifted away from extended families, unfortunately, for good and bad, we now have a lesser understanding experience of aging. I don't know if you agree with that, Richard, but I think there has become less of a respect for older people because of that. And I think maybe we need to reassess where we've gone, because we've gone from total respect, which maybe is one side that way, and we've gone to no respect now, and we need to sort of hover around the middle and understand older people, because they are such a significant part of our community and always will be, of course, maybe increasingly so. Thank you. That's a brilliant question, Richard. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Richard, for coming up and asking a question. Any more questions here? I have one. Oh, yes. You go first.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with the issue that we're discussing, I must confess. And maybe that's why I have this question. When you were discussing the values of people, like of self-values of people, you used the word habit.
Habits, yeah.
Habits, yes. And like I understood that they're very close to skills. Is there something intentional, something behind it, or like, why did you use habits instead of skills? That's my question. Thank you.
No, very, very good question. I'm going to blame Pierre Bourdieu, sorry, as I would. I don't know if everyone's come across Pierre Bourdieu. He talked about something called habitus. And in fact, I was discussing this with our signer today, just before, point to herself, just before the lecture, because the signer was asking me how I was going to interpret human value and human capital, because capital is usually that, isn't it? Yeah. Whereas I'm talking about what Pierre Bourdieu, so I'm going to blame Pierre Bourdieu, talked about as intangible capitals. That means metaphysical capitals. I don't know if we can sign metaphysics. I'd love to see the sign for metaphysics, actually. Wow. Okay. So metaphysics is something you can't see, smell, touch, hear. It's not necessarily, and we always tend to think of economy. So the skills and habits that we have in business to do my job, for example. But when we wander around, we can tell who people are. I bet I could go around Leuven and tell who the students are without even talking to them. I could probably tell who the non-students were just by talking to them. I was walking past some people working on a building earlier, and I could tell they were working on a building, not because they were doing their job. I mean, I'm sure they were going to, they were on a break, but they were standing next to it. Okay, they were wearing building gear, but they look like builders, you know what I mean? So we have different habits according to the way we've been brought up and trained that we haven't necessarily been purposely trained to have. So I look like a professor because I've been hanging around with too many professors all my life. I probably should hang out with more builders. I know some builders, even my nephew's a builder. But because of that, I have a certain way of standing, a certain way of looking, a certain way of talking. I dress in a certain way. If we have habits, then those habits are related to our understanding of the way we've been brought up in life, and we learn subconsciously. And that's what Pierre Bourdieu was talking about. And he say we think of it in different fields. So I'm sorry, I'm going to blame Pierre Bourdieu. Thank you.
I have a question myself, Simon, if I may. So I was struck by this conversation you had with Tallulah, where you were asking her about her impairments.
Yes.
And I noted that, I mean, you was something like, well, how do you interpret these, impairments? Do you see them as disabilities? That was your question. Right. And then she was like, no, I mean, it's just a nuisance, right? Which I thought is a particularly nice choice of words.
And if you knew Tallulah, the way she said that was so beautiful. It was fantastic.
It's and the funny thing is, I was teaching this morning on the what's called the mere difference view of disability. So the idea that so we tend to look at sort of disabilities as like disorders, like it's the bad things to have, right?
Right.
So I mean the association they have is, I mean, it's a negative one. So it's a bad thing to have. And so she seems to say, well, they're not this, I mean, my impairments are not disabilities and they're nuisances. I was, that sort of conversation led me to wonder how you see the difference between all these concepts like impairment, disability, disorder, and then there's nuisance.
No, absolutely.
And whether perhaps, I mean, maybe then the second part of my question is what you think about that mere difference view, or the good difference view even. I mean, the idea that maybe there is more to disability than we tend to think of, that there might be some sort of positive aspects leveling out the obvious negative ones that some people with disabilities report.
That's a really, really important question. That's a really good one. So I'll give you an example of my own impairment. So I got a hearing impairment. I got my hearing aid when I was in my 30s. My mother got her hearing aid, and admitted to her hearing impairment when she was much later in life. And my grandmother, who was born in 1895, so you can imagine the generation gap in my family, never, ever admitted to her hearing impairment, even though she was stone deaf when I was being brought up. And I'm not joking. She was absolutely stone deaf, what we call stone deaf, which is no hearing at all. And she denied it, the fact that she had it. Now, in 1895, being disabled was being called in Britain, I don't know if it's the same in Belgium, but deaf and dumb. So the word dumb came with deaf. And dumb meant unintelligent. So if you were deaf, you were unintelligent. And so there was a massive stigma about being deaf. When my mother became hearing impaired, I think she didn't like it, but she accepted it. She didn't want to be like my mother, and we weren't using the terms deaf and dumb anymore. Well, we were using them less, still about a bit, but not too much. When I was diagnosed in the hospital with a hearing impairment, and the same hearing impairment as my family, and quite often disabilities go in families, by the way, like Tallulah. Disabled hearing impairment come along later in life because other people in your family have it. It's quite often genetic. When I came along, we were having a conversation about deaf people just being deaf people. The thing that worried me is I wasn't deaf, what I would call deaf, and I didn't sign, I didn't have all of those things. So I was very nervous about that because I thought, how do I fit into that community? Well, the point is I don't. But most of the people who have a hearing impairment don't fit into that community. I don't think of myself as disabled, but I think I have a disability in certain situations. So I've managed to rationalize it in that way. There are very few disabled people who want their disability. So I don't know many people who want their disability. And we've got to admit that it is an issue. It's a problem. When I'm teaching, sometimes I can't hear my students. When with people in the audience, sometimes I find it difficult to hear. I have to lip read. And that's not because of them, it's because of me. And I have to understand that. So it's a difficult one to balance because there's an ideology that's grown up around disability. And I think we need to get away from the ideology. And unfortunately, I have a philosophy background as well. I think philosophy needs to get away from that ideology as well. I think education needs to get away from that ideology, as Peter was saying. It shouldn't be just segregation or just inclusion, but whatever people want. And I think we need to think more about the individual with the impairment and disability rather than disability as a thing. So we should go around asking people what they want rather than telling people what they need. That makes sense.
So that's kind of interesting. So you thinking of your disability as a sort of context dependent thing.
Very much.
I mean, so you may switch from being disabled to being non-disabled depending on the circumstances that you're in.
I actually wrote, I'll send you if anyone's interested. I wrote an essay, which is in a book of a collection of essays published by Springer. And the title of the paper was, "When Gucci Make Hearing Aids, I'll Be Deaf." And so I don't want to be deaf because Gucci haven't made hearing aids and it's not very fashionable to be deaf, especially when I wrote that a few years ago now. It's about 10, 15 years ago when I wrote that. So I don't want to think of myself as deaf, but I had to accept that in certain situations I am. As I said in that paper, there's subjective disability and objective disability. Objective disability is what I'm told I am. and subjective disability is what I think I am. And I'll send you the paper if you want. So I break it up to objective disability, subjective disability. And my identity is my subjective disability, but the identity imposed on me is the objective disability. So I know it's a bit quirky, but I think, again, we need to let people decide whether they're disabled and see and let them decide which way they want to be disabled as well. It's not for other people to tell me who I am. But that's the way I see it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
We have room for at least one more question. So if you feel this pressing urge to ask your question, then feel free. I'm going to have a quick look if there's any online question coming up. No more questions? I guess the audience.
Thank you very much.
Flabbergasted.
I've either answered everything or I've answered nothing. So
Yeah.
that's brilliant. Thank you so much for listening. Eva.
Well, in this case, we can close it up, and thank you, Simon, again. And thank you all for being here with us physically, and also the people attending online. And thanks for asking your questions. Bye-bye.